A lot of people didn't even know it was a museum.
Less than half of the museum was actually visible to the public.
With the design of a new Burke museum.
What I want to do is turn the inside out and show what's in the storage.
Visible labs at this scale has, as far as we know, never been done. How far can we push this and still maintain all the core functions we need to do?
And the vibrations of demolishing a parking lot and how sensitive.
All these bones, artifacts that if you damage, you just can't replace them.
Imagine it's 2008 and you're a freshman at the University of Washington in Seattle. You have an assignment on fossils for your Science 101 class, and all of your friends on the Facebook tell you to go to the Burke Museum. Only problem is, you can't find it. Fast forward to 2019, that's no longer the case. The Burke Museum is a cultural landmark on campus and in the city. Founded over 130 years ago, the Burke Museum is full of both public exhibits and scientific research. Today it has one of the foremost collections of Native American artifacts from the Pacific Northwest and sits at the entrance of the University of Washington. I'm here to learn the story behind the Burke Museum projects, but first I gotta run. I'm late for rocket science class. To get the full picture, let's talk to a University of Washington alum.
I did all my higher education at the University of Washington. So I was a freshman, but I found that the Burke was this place on campus. I really knew nothing about it. It was a funny little place. It was kind of dark and it was kind of hidden on the campus. It wasn't that particularly well known, but I found it a place that I could go to as somebody that was interested in the sciences, and I recognized that the curators and the collection, they had some really interesting things that they were dealing with, but there was a limit to it.
A lot of people didn't even know it was a museum. They couldn't find the front door. There were very few windows. Into the museum is basically a brick box.
It was a very traditional museum layout where less than half of the museum was actually visible to the public. So it was just gallery experiences. They were a bit dated.
It was clear the museum's building needed an overhaul. After years of fundraising, the Burke was ready to start the design phase.
When I was then reacquainted with the Burke, it was probably 20 years later. All of a sudden, the Burke comes back as a planning project for the firm. So we were one of the shortlisted firms, and we interviewed for the project. I couldn't have been more excited. Because on so many levels, it was a personal passion project for me.
When we first looked at the project brief, and this was in 2009 during the pre-design, was the Burke Museum had quite a bit of what we call program aspirations. And so we spent quite a bit of time testing the idea of repurposing the existing building because we felt there was a lot of embodied energy in that existing structure. And then we looked at various options of adding on to the museum. Nobody was excited about that. Part of it was actually the feasibility. The column spacing of the existing structure just didn't make sense for exhibits or displaying large objects, which the Burke had. It was really limited in the way that it would interface with the public when it came to the museum. The old museum didn't engage at all with the public or the university. And I think it was really challenging for the Burke to encourage visitorship, basically, because it was so kind of closed.
And you didn't really feel any life or anything was actually happening in the museum that was changing and vibrant. When behind the scenes, there's active research happening every single day, new discoveries being made, but you would never know that because there were literally concrete and brick walls separating the general public from all that work.
During the design phase, an innovative idea was brought up. What if the Burke took all the areas that are normally hidden out of sight and put them on display? Now, what should I touch first?
Don't even think about it.
The Burke Museum once a year would have what they call the Curator's Dinner, and it'd be a fundraising event where they would take you behind the scenes to look at the objects. And they'd open drawers full of specimens, and you got to see them firsthand. And they wanted that experience for the public when they came to the museum.
Those early tours, you could see it. You would take some behind the scenes, and the number one phrase we kept on hearing over and over again is like, I had no idea that this happened behind the scenes.
Basically, the storage basement was 100 times, 1,000 times more interesting than the museum itself. And that's where Julie was describing what I want to do is turn the inside out. I want to show what's in the storage shed.
That was really the linchpin of Inside Out. And it was like, okay, well, for better or worse, you can't give every single individual who comes to the museum their own specialized behind-the-scenes tour, but let's get as close as we can.
And that was the magic.
Now that the concept was presented, the reality of what it would look like needed to be explored.
I would say my first thought when that Inside Out idea came to me was, sounds like a great concept, but what does that actually mean?
You wouldn't have traditional exhibits per se that were these standalone dark rooms where all these curated objects would be placed that would be strenuous and a hassle to update every so often. You would actually be walking through the museum and through the collection and seeing the real objects there stored, seeing real scientists and researchers working on the objects, and that'd be part of your museum experience. It allowed the museum experience to always be fresh and live and updated basically constantly because scientists are working on different things all the time.
The intimidation was we had seen bad examples of that. We had seen museums that had that idea of having a window into the inner workings. It felt almost like weird. You were looking in this little peephole at something that had no scale, had no soul, had no really sense of ground, middle, top. And we felt, okay, well, that's information. At least we know something that doesn't work. Now, how do we make something that does work? But we didn't really have a roadmap to figure out where we were going. Just like the way science works, science actually works with failures to find successes. And we were able to find a few failures to then at least understand that that was not a direction to go.
Doing Inside Out or visible labs at this scale has, as far as we know, never been done in a museum. So like, what are the implications of that?
So the crossroads are in the center of the building where the curators are crossing with the public is crossing with the curators, and everybody is aware of each other. And that's intentional. There's no place to hide.
Most of the staff that were hired way before this project was ever conceived of, and so they weren't brought on thinking they would have to be on display all the time. And so how do we make them comfortable with that interaction and that new way of doing things?
Absolutely uncommon to have the scientists and the curators out with the population. And I think the nature of scientists they are deep thinkers, and it's a challenge for them.
It was really figuring out, well, how far can we push this and still maintain all the core functions we need to do? And let's explore what that actually means in terms of what does the architecture look like? What does the exhibit experience look like? And how do you support that with staffing and other supports so that all of that makes sense and folks can have that more personalized experience at scale? When you haven't experienced something, right, you put all of your fears and anticipation on top of that. So is there a way we can address that? Some of the key ones we heard early on with the staff, probably the one biggest one is the fishbowl, right? I'm being put in a fishbowl. What's that going to be like? Are people going to be staring at me all the time? And probably the most common one was like, are people going to knock on this glass all day long?
From the beginning, we knew that we wanted the building to feel almost as if it was part of the natural selection process. And the natural selection process is about efficiency.
When the old Burke Museum was still in place, the exhibit team had done a few kind of prototypical exhibits where they would try it out and just see how it would go.
So that was the editing process, because nature is the premier editor. If you think about it, an architecture at its core is editing.
So we built labs that had many of the same features over there, but they were very temporary in nature. They were just built with OSB and off-the-shelf Home Depot style windows and doors to try and just try it. And the nature of that level of finish gave us a lot of opportunity to say, this is an experiment, right? To everyone, both to our visitors and to our staff. And we could say, you know what, if this doesn't work this week, we'll try it again next week in a different way. And that just relieves so much of that anxiety and pressure. It's like, oh, okay, if it doesn't work, we can actually change it.
We went through a number of tests and a number of iterations, and some of them are really bad, you know? And you just, well, okay, that's not a good one.
And so we tried different things about what makes people knock on the glass. The results were really surprising. Originally, we thought, well, the way we prevent that knocking on the glass is we'll put reader rail. That was encouraging folks to knock because A, everyone wanted to get as close as possible to the work, and so they would have to lean in over this obstruction. And also what we learned is when you have those reader rails printed material, it feels really permanent. And when you come to the Burke now, the experience we have is you look around and you see a lot of whiteboards, which ended up being the cheapest, easiest solution to our interpretation in the labs. But it gives you that sense that, no, this thing changes every single day. And so people get answers to the questions about, well, what are you doing right here, right, today? Whereas those permanent panels, we couldn't express specifically what's happening today. We could say, generally, this lab does this, which was definitely not our first take, right? Our first take was trying to kind of be more defensive design, and it turned out removing all that defensiveness and going to this much more adaptable, much less expensive solution ended up solving that.
Visiting a museum is supposed to be an interactive learning experience. For the Burke team, not only were the exhibits themselves important, but placement of each exhibit plays a vital role in the success of a museum.
It was very much, in the end, a traditional museum. Yes, we were going to put the labs and workspaces on display, but more like a traditional museum, those were going to be the upper floors, and those are going to be the research floors. And then on the bottom two floors were going to be the more traditional gallery experiences. And as we kind of played with that and explored what the exhibits would be like, we had that epiphany moment where it's like, yes, there's a little more to see, but what's propelling the visitor to go up to that second and third floor and see the research?
Wayfinding is something in the museum world, it's a large discussion. You know, in a casino, they don't want you to find your way out. They don't want you to know where the end is. And some of the museums actually feel that way. You know, they're so big and they ramble and you get lost. And there's two things that happen. You get frustrated because you don't know the plan and you don't know if you saw everything.
One of the important parts of organizing the Burke program was to prioritize the collections. There's over 18 million objects at the Burke Museum right now. It's very clear that the collections, the objects themselves, were of highest importance. And so the way that we developed the plan was almost a 2/3 to 1/3, where 2/3 of it is just storage of the object. So it's almost this box where all the objects, these 18 million objects, would live. And then we bifurcated the plan lengthwise with a stair and a light shaft. And what was really important was that when you enter the museum through the front door, you turn and you see this vertical volumetric connection all the way up the 3 floors.
Well, the staircase is very much about wayfinding. It was very much about a rational way from getting to point A to point B and seeing point A to point B and collecting it so that you knew that you weren't lost. You always are aware of the ologies, you're aware of the offices, you're aware of the open space, and you're aware of the people in the Burke.
It served as kind of a natural navigation tool where you could see the collections that you would be drawn to further up in the museum.
Now, the number one thing I would say most people go to natural history museums to go to see are the dinosaurs, right? You take your kids, they want to see the dinosaurs. And so we kind of took the approach like a grocery store, right? We put what you need at the farthest end of the building on the top floor at the other side from the admissions desk, because we wanted to pull folks through the building to what they really wanted to see, and then through that, they would interact with other areas that might be a surprise to them or something they hadn't expected to interact with or see. There's the windows behind me where you can see the dinosaurs from the parking lot. So a kid can say, like, I'm going to go there, and they instantly know before they even walk in the building where they're headed.
Speaking of parking lots, right now I'm standing inside the Burke Museum. Well, technically I'm standing where the Burke used to be 5 years ago. Building the new Burke next to the old Burke was harder than it sounds.
A significant difference between the old museum and the new museum is its placement on the site. The existing building was smack dab in the middle. It made it really difficult for people as they passed by the university or by the museum to understand what the function of the building was. And the new museum is right along 15th Avenue, and it's a linear building that stretches the entire block. It's a perfect location for a museum whose program serves both the university community, but also the greater community of Seattle, because it serves as that threshold between the campus and the community.
Building the new museum and moving from one building to another was no different than a student switching dorm rooms across campus. If that student had 18 million irreplaceable artifacts. A project this delicate needed a build team up to the task.
We spent a considerable amount of time planning all those aspects, whether it's logistically, how do we get subcontractors and where are we going to build the building, the sequencing of the building, ensuring that the existing museum could be up and operational. How do they continue to bring patrons in? Because honestly, they needed to keep funding coming. They needed money coming in to allow that funding to happen. So we were looking about all those. And so we looked at the three different phases, what it amounts to be building a new building, and then a period of time of allowing the museum to move in and build exhibits into the existing building. And then that third phase of knocking down the building were very strategic. They were challenging. They were very challenging.
One of the things that we did not, or I personally didn't account for, was how sensitive the existing museum was with the artifacts in there. And the vibrations of demolishing a parking lot, cutting down trees, my gosh, even walking by the museum, of how sensitive it was to the artifacts and vibrations. It was amazing.
And we set up a vibration system on the inside of the museum that we checked daily during the excavation process, because you're just grinding on the dirt 50, 100 yards away from all these bones, artifacts, you name it, that if you damage, you just can't replace them. And you don't want to be that person that digs something the wrong way and something falls over.
We didn't break anything, but boy, I'll tell you what, we did everything in lieu of digging a 10-foot ditch and putting peat in between the two buildings.
The Burke Museum had some fun little challenges for us that they gave us along the way. One was whale bones. So we knew that they had this big whalebone structure that we're putting all this reinforcement into the structure of the building. We knew where it was going, but they came out with this big chunk of whalebones and they asked us to move it around for them. We got it picked up, we put it on top of their existing building while we're building the new one.
The smells coming off of those were substantial.
If you're standing on top of the new Burke Museum and the wind went the wrong way, it smelled pretty bad, but it's just part of the process, I guess.
Sounds like Skanska had a whale of a good time during construction, but sometimes having a lot of experience can bite you in the ass.
It was kind of funny. Back in phase one, my foreman called me up and said, the Burke has asked us to assist them with offloading something from a truck. And I said, well, absolutely. And then I got thinking about that and reached out to Eldon, So what is this that we're moving? And he told me it was a T-Rex head.
It was shock. This is one of 7 actual T-Rex skulls in the world. All the others are just replicas. And we had to figure out how to get it off of this truck safely.
We were supposed to stop at that, just get it on the ground, but then we got kind of pulled into maneuvering it through the existing museum.
And then safely get it into the building, which had, coming out of the truck, you had to go down a little bit. Going into the loading dock, you had to go another step. And well, we figured it out. We worked with the archaeologists and we got it in, and they took it from there and brought it to where they needed to work on it.
You know what? It was a team effort, but that's as far as we got with moving any kind of artifacts.
Like many universities, most of the buildings on the University of Washington are clad in brick. For the new Burke, the design team went in a different direction.
Well, when you put a new building at the University of Washington, we have our architectural commission that reviews the new buildings that we intend to build on campus. And this is done for continuity within the university so that we don't get outliers.
Design review boards, and at the University of Washington it's called the Architectural Commission. Those are always nerve-wracking experiences because you do have your peers and other professionals that come to the table with their opinions, and so it's definitely a test in diplomacy. But ultimately, for the Burke Museum, it's especially nerve-wracking because we had met with the committee 2 or 3 times during the process in which we were looking at renovating the museum, and all the comments pretty consistently were negative and against what we were after. So in a way, they had already threatened to disapprove the project. So by the 3rd or 4th one, when we came forward with the new design, we were super nervous going into that presentation.
At one point we did have it in brick, at one point we did have it in metal. Because it was an institutional building, we thought, well, maybe we have to meet the campus planning. But at some point, we started talking about it being in wood, because wood is, and this is the most important thing, wood is a material that shows time.
The wood that we used doesn't have a stain or other finish on it. And so it's meant to age naturally with time. And we knew that the wood over time would age and weather differently on each side of the building based on the weather that it was exposed to, but also the sun. And we embraced that. We liked the idea that as a natural history museum, it would age naturally. It was a natural product.
And because there's such a significant component to the museum, to the cultural First Nations of Washington State, in particular the Coast Salish tribes.
When Julie Stein, the director of the Burke, had first presented the wood-sided building, it was met very favorably by the tribes because they saw reference to their histories and the ties to the land, obviously the timber industry here and the forests.
That their cedar and wood structures were part of the built environment here, and they naturally grade with time. And that was it. That was the intention, is that the building would change.
The wood has gone from a brown, almost reddish color from when it was first installed to kind of a gray, and sometimes even black in some areas. And so it makes perfect sense, and over time it will settle into its environment and its context, I think, better as it ages. The people that were on our building committee were really excited once we presented the new museum. Their comments were very productive and actually ultimately resulted in a successful project.
Even the best laid plans have unforeseen challenges. For the Burke, despite all the planning and preparation, they were faced with a funding issue they could have never predicted.
So we had funding from the state of Washington that got us through May, June, and we had worked backwards from that time when we would receive the next tranche of state funding. And unfortunately for that legislative session, it went over, which delayed the receipt of our funding.
And that funding was part of our phased funding for getting paid for the job. So I think it was roughly about 2.5, 3 months where we had this open building and we had to figure out what to do with very limited resources.
We already started the siding at that point in time, so the last thing we wanted to do was stop halfway through an elevation, start back up in 6 months to a year, and the color has already started changing in the wood.
We wanted to get this building to a state where it was going to be dry, it was going to be safe, and sheltered in place pretty much.
We were able to crew down and continue working to minimize the impact of the final dollar. So we never actually stopped doing the exterior siding, even though we were planning on it. With crewing down and just continuing the installation at a slower pace, we were able to continue.
We worked with Sessler, we worked with the University of Washington, we worked with Olson Kundig, all of our subcontractors. We came together as a team and figured out how to button up and preserve the overall product of the museum so that when we got the money back, we could continue forward and not lose anything.
So I decided to take a break here in the Off the Res Cafe. I have my coffee here. I have some beautiful pastries that look delicious. It's a beautiful day out, and I just wish that this wall of windows could just go away. Just a second. What's this? Hey, get out of the way. Move. Move it, move it. Hurry. What?
Well, the gizmo door originally was not part of the Burke Natural History Museum, but it came not from us. It came from Julie Stein, who said, we need a gizmo.
They kept talking about this gizmo door, and I kept thinking that, how's this gonna work?
In order for them to work, we have to actually be the energy, the power, but we're using weights, we're using pulleys, we're using, all sorts of mechanical advantages. As soon as you're moving the gizmo, you're part of the natural world.
I'm moving a wall.
And the natural world is part of you, because it doesn't work until you basically engage in all this.
Well, it's freezing outside. I don't know what I was thinking. I need to get this thing down as fast as possible. Oh my God. It's Seattle.
Well, I think it's important to understand what keeps me at the university, and projects like the Burke Museum keep me there. And it's not that it's just a building and that it serves as, a project, or we did it for X million dollars, or we didn't do it for this reasons, but we delivered something to the community that makes the community a better place.
Throughout my time here, it's been reinforced over and over again by just my experience, how interconnected everything is. And so how we have to protect all those little parts, because, right, it's kind of like that sweater, you pull on one thread and the whole thing falls apart. And so we need to see how those things are interconnected so we can value them, so we can protect them.
Architecture is about being a human being and how you move through space. So until you have people moving through space and experiencing it, it's kind of meaningless.
Closing out a project like this and then seeing the end use of the people coming to see what they have so much more space, so they had so many things that were tucked away in a basement that were never seen. So to have all that at display and to watch people walk around, it's pretty darn cool.
I always say you know what's successful by all the number of fingerprints and nose prints on the glass, and that place has a lot of fingerprints and nose prints because the kids in particular are really interested and they lean in and want to see what's happening.
But really, ultimately, the real magic of a building is when the community, and especially a building like the Burke, is when the kids come in, when the community comes in, and they use that building, because that's the magic. That's how you do architecture.
I'm Ben Roberts, and this has been Design vs. Build.